Welcome back, everybody. It is the regular version of the Decline and Fall show today, coming to you with a series of programs which feature all the latest in imperial decay, from the decaying hamburger-driven mind of Donald Trump to the decaying girdle-strapped form of Sir Keir Starmer, to the decaying form of the dictator of Baku and his employers in London and Ankara. All around us is decay and the morbid symptoms of the terminal decline of late-stage monopoly capitalism. And that foul stench you smell as you step out your door in the morning is nothing more than a rotting culture permeating your nasal cavities and invading your consciousness. However, when faced with an invasion of consciousness, though we can't do much about the nasal cavities, what better antidote is there than to have a counter narrative? And the counter narrative to defend your consciousness against late stage monopoly capitalism's cultural rot is, of course, the Decline and Fall show, which is coming to you today from an undisclosed location in Scotland and an even more undisclosed location in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Kit, from your undisclosed location, how are you doing today?
Good, very, very good. And I mean, I think that we've had a lot of decline in recent days and recent weeks, and I think that we might be getting to the fully fledged fall stage. As we shall dive into with our typical vigor. So thanks for joining us, everyone. We've got a great show for you today, if I do say so myself. Why don't you kick off, Alex?
Well, first of all, I would urge everybody watching this to subscribe to the YouTube channel. To go and subscribe over on the Substack as well, so you can keep track of everything that we do. And also be sure to watch the very good interview we did with Armenian journalist Alison Tamizian Musa, which came out yesterday, some of which will be referenced later on in the program. But why don't we, as Kit suggests, dive into this swamp? And first up, as promised when we talked last week, it's the evolving story of just what the hell the Trump administration's policy really is. In fact, you could say that on just about anything. But here we are with the Wall Street Journal opinion page praising Trump. Now, if you're at all familiar with the Wall Street Journal, it's a curious hybrid of pretty decent reporting on like economic affairs and even some foreign affairs stuff in terms of its actual reporting. Its opinion pages, though, come a broadcast straight from Dick Cheney's crypt. And this is a fine example of that. And they're referring, of course, to Trump stating in a press conference and then rambling about it repeatedly that he was sick of Putin basically being very polite but saying no to him. This rather tickled the fancy of the Wall Street Journal opinion page, who are now very happy with the fact that Trump is now sounding more like Biden, basically. Because what Trump said, in essence, was that he was ringing Putin, and Putin basically has kept reiterating the official position of the Russian government. And Trump is now getting apparently tired of this. But in my view, what is being unveiled here is that Trump's actual position, when it came down to it, is in essence the position outlined by General Kellogg, who was assigned to be the point man on this, even though the Russians don't want to speak to him, which was that the plan that Kellogg put his name to, published, I believe, before Trump came into office, which was that essentially Russia would keep basically what it's got at the moment, in terms of former Ukrainian territory. The Kiev regime would be left in place, and there would be a commitment to not join NATO for a decade or so. So it's essentially a slightly more advanced version of what was already on the table in early 2022 from the Biden administration, who kept saying, oh, Ukraine's not joining NATO. But as we'll see, and when we talk about this, and when we talk about the Azerbaijan relationship with NATO, there's more than one way to be part of NATO. There's also different tiers of NATO membership and involvement. And if the Russians accepted the deal that Trump through Steve Witkoff, in the end, was putting to them, they would essentially agree that the Kiev regime should remain in place. And if the Kiev regime remains in place, even if there's no NATO, not formally anyway, what will happen is the same process that occurred prior to early 2022, which is that the British in particular, but also the French now and the Germans, will work to recover the situation for the Ukrainian military and basically use the gap in the fighting to rearm and retool and retrain their Ukrainian outsourced army, then launch it again at the Russians in a few years' time, which would not only be unacceptable to the Russian government, but it would also create severe internal political problems for Putin and others at the top of the Russian government. So the fact that the Russians didn't go for this should be no surprise to anybody. It is apparently a surprise to Trump. And now, like the Wall Street Journal and the other what I would call like extreme militarists inside the US Imperium are thinking that they're going to get their way again. But Kit, I'll throw to you now for your analysis of where things stand with regard to this and the apparent contradictory and sort of swirling bullshitting of the Trump administration.
Well, I mean, I might at this point take our viewers back to in the lead up to the 2024 US presidential election. Putin said that it didn't matter who won the election, and there was all sorts of speculation about how this was some 5D chess move in which he was trying to manipulate people into thinking that he didn't want Trump to win when he did. No. I think that what he was saying was literally true, is that it wasn't going to change anything, Trump getting in, despite his assorted pledges to end this within 48 hours of taking office, or within 90 days of taking office, or you know, all of these ever-changing, rock solid undertakings. And yes, effectively, as is so often, as has been the case over and over again, when on the rare occasions that US and European officials actually talk to the Russians, they reiterate their position, which has remained unchanged since February 2022, if not before, which is neutral Ukraine, no foreign missile systems on its soil, a limit on how big its armed forces can be, and yes, a moratorium on NATO membership. Now, setting out a fairly basic, set of requirements, which this is a generous versus what the US would demand of Canada or NATO, Canada or Mexico, if a Russian-led NATO alternative existed and they were on the verge of joining it. It's unsurprising that we remain at this impasse, and I think that we've also seen recently that there, as we reported on and kind of broke the story which passed the media by, there was a moratorium on any further military aid to Ukraine. This was then further revised to even the existing commitments from the Biden administration wouldn't be sent. We'll get into this more later, but this seems to have been undone. The significance of that is questionable, to say the least, although for the time being the narrative is Trump has had enough of Putin's intransigence, and the US is back in the game in terms of supporting Ukraine. I don't actually think that this is true, for reasons that we can get into.
Well, the way in which this is being presented now is that Trump is changing his mind and is going to be basically back in to the same mode that the Biden administration was in, including, of course, we'll just share this from the New York Times. there's going to be a vote on even more sanctions against Russian oil and gas and other things as well, which the Lindsey Graham led faction in the U.S. Senate, which is almost all of the U.S. Senate, are trumpeting this. But there is a problem with both of these angles, as Kit suggests, which is that the problem that they have with the weapons supplies is that they just don't have what Ukraine needs. And aren't likely to have it in the short term or even the medium term either, because they've already had to switch priorities. And part of it was the fact that Israel was essentially getting a beating from Iran. And now the US needs to switch to putting more air defense, such as that exists inside Israel, resupplying Israel with both missiles and ammunition, readying for the next round with Iran, which everybody knows is coming. Apart from, it would appear, the president of Iran, but that's another story. So Ukraine, even if Trump says, "Oh, we're back in the game," isn't going to get what it needs. If you look at like the reports coming even from like pro-NATO sources such as Julian Rupke and others who've always been sort of fanatically pro-NATO, admitting that the Russian airstrikes and missile strikes on Ukraine now dwarf anything that's happened before, and that the advances of the Russian armed forces are huge in comparative terms and gaining in momentum every day. So the fact is that we're going back to the sanctions question, why would this work when the previous, 19 rounds haven't worked at all? So a lot of this is posturing, and a lot of this is just melodramatics. Trump probably thinks, if Trump does think, that if he sort of bangs the table and screams a lot, that the Russians will back down. He still either doesn't understand or could never understand that the Russians not only won't back down, but can't, in essence, because this is the reason why the whole special military operation started in the first place. So a lot of it is just noise. And I think it comes back to the fact that the policy, I think Trump, if he had his own way, wanted to just impose this Kellogg deal on the Russians and basically say that the war wasn't his problem anymore, get Ukraine to say no to NATO formally for 10 years, then he can say the war is over and focus elsewhere. None of this is happening. So instead, because they can't actually help the Kiev regime much with anything anymore, what they'll do is pretend to and make a lot of noise about it and try and go along with the British policy of just spinning out the war at all costs. So that is in effect what is going on. It won't change anything, but it changes the mood music, which is, I think, Kit, all that some people in Washington were actually looking for, which is a change in like the tone and the messaging rather than the content.
Yeah, precisely. And it's like, I mean, I think back to that what increasingly looks like a staged incident. Was it in February or March when JD Vance and Trump had a major bust up with Zelensky? Now, if you think about like the response to the kind of Russiagate Blue Anon response to that was, well, we now have proof that Trump is a Russian asset and that the tapes of him being peed on in Moscow do exist, etc. Like now that the rhetoric of negativity towards Russia and hostility and agitation is back, well, people are a bit like, okay, thank God. Okay, that's fine. And it's like, and that's all it amounts to, because it's, again, we're kind of like skipping around the show notes slightly here. But I think what's important to know is that a large number of people who were cheering the fact that US military aid was seemingly over for Ukraine and wondering how long Ukraine could hold on, I was certainly in the latter category. I thought that this could well be, the kind of final stages of this. I and a great many people were caught off guard by Trump resuming announcing that he was going to resume weapon shipments, and the pause was blamed on poor Pete Hegseth, who seems to be the kind of whipping boy and fool guy for whenever Trump has to do a reverse ferret. But if you actually look at the detail of what Trump is offering, is claiming that he is going to send to the Ukrainians. Emphasis on claiming. Okay, number one, it's defensive weapons. So this is not assisting Ukraine to carry out strikes in Russia against Russia, which is a very crucial caveat. And it does tend to suggest that the US, as far as it has a strategy in Ukraine, is just kind of push this out as long as possible, with the inevitable outcome being that Russia emerges victorious. The only question is by how much and how long that takes. But even then, when you break down what these defensive weapons amount to. This includes stuff like the Patriot missiles, which, number one, have been consistently shown to be completely useless, and Russia has pretty consistently just destroyed outright, and an enormous amount of very difficult and costly to replace missiles have been used in the process. The Guardian has published an exclusive report that the US has only a quarter of all Patriot missile interceptors needed for Pentagon military plans, and according to the Guardian, the Pentagon has what's known as a global munitions tracker internally, which is meant to tabulate how many weapons the US has and ensure that limits on its stockpiles aren't breached and dipped into. And it seems that this has been the case since the Biden administration, that well-established restrictions on what can be used and sent to allies have basically been torn up and ignored. So they don't even have the defensive weapons they claim they're going to send to Ukraine, which would probably not be particularly effective anyway. As I have seen numerous, and I even include it in the show notes, I've seen numerous maps of recent Russian missile and drone strikes on Ukraine. They're quite extraordinary. They are striking everywhere across the country. They are wiping out all manner of infrastructure, and there's the Russians also seem to be targeting conscription sites or centers where people who are dragged off the streets of major Ukrainian cities and ferried to against their will, so they can die on the front line horribly within about an hour of arrival. These recruitment centres appear to be getting targeted specifically. Now, this doesn't only wipe out potential new recruits. I've seen some people, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, suggest this is a way of Russia winning hearts and minds in Ukraine by wiping out all of the much-hated conscription gangs roaming the streets.
Well, I think that there might be something to that, given that there is a considerable internal revolt inside Ukraine, according to analysts such as former Swiss military intelligence officer Colonel Jacques Beau, who seems to be tracking this. There are several internal rebel factions inside Ukraine now, not all of which, by the way, are pro-Russian. There are rebel groups inside the west of Ukraine, in the heart of Bandera land, where they are actively resisting the press gang operations that have been roving around, abducting any man who stands still longer than about a second. And there's considerable domestic opposition to these press gangs, just as really the actual support for the continuation of the war is very low, even in Ukraine, because they actually so that Zelensky, Ulyak, and others can beat a retreat eventually to their villas in Miami, and nobody wants to die for that. But also, the fact is that the TCC itself, the press gang operation, I had should we say, a source from Moscow emailed me a while back with some details on where the TCC came from. And what this source, whose information on Ukrainian matters has been good before, said was that the TCC was actually founded as a private company in 2007. So this is latter period of Yushchenko. They were setting up like press gang operations run by essentially a private company operating under contract to the Kiev government for almost 20 years ago now, and had been because the plan was already there that this would happen eventually. They wanted it under Yushchenko, but he was, didn't have the necessary force in place to do it. But they continued to develop the TCC all the way through the intervening Yanukovych years, until they were ready to launch it in a major way. So this press gang operation, which is so loathed by Ukrainians, was a hell of a long time in the making. And apparently the British were heavily involved with its foundation, which again shouldn't be a surprise. But the fact that the Russians are going after this in the way they are now, which has led even the American press in the form of the Washington Post to admit that this is happening, and also that this is clearly which most Ukrainians are going to welcome, these bastards getting blown the hell. It's clear that the Russians do have an eye for the next phase, which is that whatever Ukrainians' opinions on the Russian government, the fact is that the Kiev regime has got to the point now where it is so despised and so hated by an awful lot of Ukrainians that actually whatever the Russians do in the next phase is probably, if it brings peace and relative stability, the actual space for the kind of insurgency that the British in particular want to wage, the political space for that, is going to be limited, because the Kiev regime, the longer it continues, the more disgraced and despised it's going to get, and the more difficult it will be to hold it up as a government in exile, which more Ukrainians should die for. So I think this is probably a smart move on behalf of the Russians. And it also speaks to the fact that, again, the longer this goes on, in actual fact, the less likely it is that many Ukrainians are going to want to sign on for the guerrilla war that the NATO countries, or some of the NATO countries, have in mind. What do you reckon to that, Kim?
Well, absolutely. And I think that, before the war even started, there were people like Hillary Clinton who were talking about recreating an Afghan 1970 and 80s style insurgency in Ukraine that would just make occupation a nightmare for the Russians. We have, of course, I myself at the Grey Zone have exposed British plans to craft secret partisan armies and Gladio style units across Ukraine who on paper are normal people living normal lives, but would carry out sabotage and assassinations and bombings and all sorts of things. As you mentioned, like, the enthusiasm just isn't there. Now, if you actually look at if you look at polls, which is this is something that is amazingly absent from any mainstream discussion of continuing the war, where as we've discussed, you have all of these people like George Monbiot saying, well, the Ukrainians want to keep fighting, so we should just keep going. It is a lie. They don't want. They don't. Yes, even in the Banderite heartlands of Western Ukraine, they don't want this to carry on, and there is growing levels of I would say like outright hatred of the Zelensky government because of a variety, and again we'll get into this in due course, a variety of things that he has done using the powers vested in him under martial law. The presidential election, which didn't happen last year, we were meant to have elections in Ukraine this year. Then they're not going to happen either. It seems it is likely, if they did, that Zelensky's Servants of the People Party would be completely wiped out. Therefore, leaving him pretty much left out in the cold, despite his sweeping powers under martial law, and also as well, it's I think that the general population is just so tired of this that even the BBC published a report a few months back, which it didn't get nearly enough traction, but it was talking about how the BBC spoke to a large number of residents of the Ukraine, and overwhelmingly, people said that they thought that Ukraine should have gone for peace in April 2022. When we know that Boris Johnson personally sabotaged it. And amazingly, of course, we know that the key to sabotaging the peace negotiations from Britain's perspective was portraying Bucha, which is a very mysterious incident, as a deliberate genocide of innocent Ukrainian civilians. And that same BBC report acknowledged that the peace negotiations were hampered by quote-unquote alleged Russian war crimes. Now, this is the same British state broadcaster that put out a programme called Ukraine, the Information War, featuring our dear friend Paul Mason, in which it was stated by numerous talking heads, including Mariana Spring, the head of BBC's Verify division and a very spooky individual, saying anyone questioning Bucha is Russian culpability for Bucha is assisting, whether wittingly or not, Russian disinformation strategies. And now the BBC acknowledges that the Russian culpability for the event is only alleged, and serious questions hang over what happened and why and who was actually responsible. Yeah, I think that basically we've reached this point where you have a population who is not willing to fight any longer, that wants this over. The determination to keep this going is not shared by the Ukrainian population, but also I would say Ukraine's political class. The only reason that they are clinging on is because they know that they are likely to be hung, drawn, and quartered if they don't escape first. So that, and they see it as an opportunity. They see keeping this going as an opportunity to, make enough money so they can escape safely to Miami or perhaps London or somewhere else. But another aspect of this as well that I found quite interesting, and this is I thought it was a bombshell report from Bloomberg, which didn't get nearly enough traction, and it was Bloomberg is, much like the Wall Street Journal, actually worth reading because it does have some good analysis in there. I mean, after all, this is what major investors read, and investors don't make money based on superhero propaganda about Ukrainians. And so on July 5th, the Bloomberg reported, that a fund for Ukraine's reconstruction, administered by BlackRock, had been put on hold at the start of 2025 because BlackRock was unable to find any institutional state or oligarchic investor who was willing to put any money into it whatsoever. And it remains effectively in limbo, and its future is quote unquote uncertain. The US is not putting anything into it whatsoever. Now, that should give you some idea of the actual level of commitment to Ukraine's prosperous democratic future, and indeed the US's commitment and ability to truly give Ukraine the weaponry necessary to defend itself, let alone drive Russia out of its territory. But there is a wider point underpinning all this, which is that when this fund was effectively seeded at a Davos summit in January 2023, where you had Russia was of course banned from attending because why not, and Zelensky gave a number of speeches during the 5-day conference. There were numerous panels on the future of Ukraine and the economic gains that could be made from investing in its reconstruction, and representatives of BlackRock and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs were all talking about how Ukraine will become a beacon of capitalism, and as it gets rebuilt, there are going to be real returns and on investment for people who get involved. We are so far away from there right now, like 2.5 years on. No major corporation or oligarch or government in the West wants anything to do with this, because they know that there is no peace on the horizon, or at least a favourable peace from Ukraine's perspective. But also, the likelihood is that there's not going to be much left of Ukraine for Western investors to pick at once this is all said and done.
Yeah, deals to other problems for the imperialists with regard to Ukraine. First of all, on the top level thing is that Ukraine itself, though it does have valuable farmland and natural resources, Ukraine itself was never the prize. They'd already got everything that they could have got out of Ukraine for 2022. Like the Ukraine farmland was sold off all the way through the 90s and the 2000s to various different agribusiness companies, some of which were in collaboration with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is, of course, a Cold War tool set up by Britain and America, which was specifically there to capitalize projects that were designed to break up and privatize and asset strip the Soviet industrial and agricultural legacy. So they'd already done all the robbery that they possibly could by 2014. 2014 was not about getting their hands on Ukraine. Ukraine is a means to an end, in essence. Ukraine is a means by which the US and the British would instigate a series of problems for the government of the Russian Federation that would lead to, they hoped, ultimately, regime change in Moscow itself. And that's what all of this was geared around. So BlackRock would have only have been interested in Ukraine if a much bigger payday was coming down the road, which was, of course, getting to dismember and devour the industry and resources of Russia itself. That's the much, much bigger prize here. And so now it's all gone south, and the US, or the Anglo-American side, is losing. That the big hedge fund and the various oligarchy don't want anymore. isn't really a surprise, because no matter what, it was never about Ukraine. Dismember Russia. The second point is that whatever is left of Ukraine is going to be, if it's not directly occupied by Russia, is going to be run by a pro-Russian Kiev-based government that is not likely to be wanting to respect the claims of various different US and British hedge funds, parasites, oligarchs, etc., who robbed the nation blind up to this point. So this is as far as investors are concerned, this is a non-starter. The final point I'll make is that they spent over $1 trillion, I think, in Afghanistan over 20 years, a huge amount of which was money that was earmarked for so-called reconstruction in Afghanistan. And in 20 years, the US and the British barely even built a road in Afghanistan. They had a far, far worse record than the late period Soviet. They were in Afghanistan. They built essentially nothing. Afghanistan and back into Washington, back into London, etc. So any reconstruction go on in Ukraine, such as, for instance, I'll just share this one now, this Ukraine Recovery Conference, which is going on right now. So if you're in Rome today and tomorrow, dear listeners, then why don't you go along and see if you can get in? I doubt they'll let you in there. So this is a farce, this Ukraine Recovery Conference, because there'll be commitments made. Any commitment that will be made to reconstruction in Ukraine, that's just money that will go through Ukraine and out the other side again. And find its way back to the United States, to Britain and other imperialist countries. The Ukrainians would see no reconstruction whatsoever go on, because this is a deeply parasitical system that can't actually build anything. They just want to rinse money and fuck off, essentially. And so the reconstruction of Ukraine, even if they managed to cling on, the Kiev regime clung on, there would be no reconstruction. The only thing that would get repaired would be the munitions production, and that would be about it.
Indeed, and I think, yes, that it is important to bear in mind as well that this Ukraine Recovery Conference happening now in Rome was meant to be when the grand announcement of this Ukraine Recovery Fund, which now doesn't exist. What's quite interesting, I mean, if you delve into that that Bloomberg report, and we will have the paywall-free version in our show notes on our Substack, check it out. It notes that initially that there was a high degree of investor interest in ploughing money into this because of the claims of huge returns to be had from Ukraine. And also the expectation that year's the 2023 counteroffensive was going to finally drive the Russians out of Ukraine forever, and potentially even lead to Ukrainian forces marching on Crimea. Of course, in the event, it was a total and utter disaster of epic, kind of historic proportions, with up to 100,000 Ukrainian casualties, and a lot of their exorbitant Western armor and vehicles and ammunition destroyed, abandoned, so that it served as a disincentive for investors, but also there were concerns, per Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, about Ukraine having enough skilled workers left. Now, according to the Ukrainian government's own figures published at the start of July, 40% of the country's working age population has been lost since as a result of the proxy war. Now, the Ukrainians are not known for being honest about their losses, so the figure could be even higher. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I was just going to say this is likely an understatement, given the fact that not only have they received a greater number of casualties than they are prepared to admit to, but also like a gigantic amount of the population ran as soon as the special military operation began, much of it to Russia, and will never return.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's like this also as well. It's just the fact that the I also think that there is the frustration of Trump in not being able to finish this. I think that in itself, I mean, yes, that there is an element of kind of showcraft, or kind of stage management of his alleged frustration. But you got to bear in mind that this does speak to the decline of the US empire, that they're unable to stop this. Because in just as a brief history lesson, the 1992 to 1995 Bosnian War, similarly to Ukraine, it was deliberately prolonged by Western powers who encouraged their Bosnian proxies to reject peace deals from the EU and the UN and whatnot, and to keep this going. They then decided that after 3 years, or 3.5 years, we've had enough, and we need enough people left alive to work for subsistence wages for US corporations, that they decided to end the war, which could have ended many times previously. But that was at a time when the US enjoyed a total global hegemony. There is now nothing that they can do to stop Russia prosecuting this war to its conclusion. They can't get militarily involved directly because that will lead to World War III, which they know they can't fight. There's no inducements that they can offer the Russians to make them stop, as it were. There is no negotiating position for the US to start from whatsoever. So we see the decline of the U.S. empire within 30 years. I mean, it's quite remarkable. I mean, this was the war in Bosnia occurred at a time when Russia was this economic basket case led by a Western puppet in the form of Boris Yeltsin, who was drunk out of his mind and didn't really know what he was doing, and was taking direct orders from Clinton on most issues. China wasn't in a position to do anything because they were still extremely poor, and were in a period of they were only just really starting the period of major technological and social and economic development that we see playing out now. Trump has talked a lot about Zelensky not having cards, or Putin not having cards. The US has no cards in this whatsoever. And yes, I think that all of these issues, which are scaring away international investors, they are only going to get worse. And in a bitter irony, of the UK, the British Foreign Office has its key aid program in Ukraine. In publicly available documents related to it, they openly admit that their objective is for Ukraine to implement economic reforms, therefore enhancing trade opportunities with the UK. And it's also acknowledged that Britain saw the invasion not only as a crisis, but also as an opportunity. But contradictorily, as we've discussed, Britain's secret project Alchemy, this military and intelligence cell created by the Ministry of Defence, is determined to keep Ukraine fighting at all costs. Well, the longer that Ukraine keeps fighting, the chances of quote-unquote trade opportunities with Kiev are rapidly diminishing.
Yes, and that's not the only thing that's rapidly diminishing. It also according to this story from Ukrainska Pravda, there is a rapidly diminishing faith in any kind of future amongst actual Ukrainians, because, well, why wouldn't there be? Ever since Ukrainian independence, which happened on a large, well, completely false basis, the various promises made by people like Kravchuk, Kushma, and then Yushchenko, and now, of course, then Poroshenko, and then Zelensky, about the wonderful European future in Joseph Borrell's garden, have just turned to ashes in the mouth, quite literally in this case. And those that are left do not believe that Ukraine has much of a future. If it indeed has a future, it'll be as a truncated country which is wholly in the Russian sphere of influence, and is never going to be able to join the EU. He's never going to be able to join NATO. By the way, both of those things are positive developments, by the way. Nobody should want to join either of these organizations. But it does show you where 30 years of like pro-US, pro-British, pro-EU politicians have taken Ukraine, which is from one of the most advanced parts of the former Soviet Union to a ruined, deindustrialized, depopulated wasteland. And that's, of course, been made worse by the war. But this was happening anyway. This was happening before the war. Like, it was already being asset stripped. It was already being deindustrialized. The birth rate had already collapsed. There was already mass migration out of the country. Because essentially, this is what has happened to almost all of the former People's Republics and Soviet states, which is that they've all been asset stripped to the bone, and the population has been demoralized to the point where they either just stay in one place and don't try and ignore the horrors going on around them, or they flee to the West. And the war has accelerated those processes, but it didn't invent them. Those processes have been in place since the mid-90s, when it became obvious just how bad the collapse of the Soviet Union was and just how terrible it was going to be for the great majority of Ukrainians. The war is just the final stage of horror that the pro-US, pro-British clique in Kiev has inflicted upon the Ukrainian population, is it not?
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, this feeds more widely into another key point of discussion, which is that these issues that for today, these issues that Ukraine is suffering, they are also being suffered throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and a key cause of that is, funnily enough, EU and NATO membership. So even Ukrainians who bought into the barefaced lie that they were going to end up in the EU and NATO as a result of Maidan. I mean, if that was to happen, then that would just further facilitate and greatly speed up the country's total collapse. People, a significant proportion, if Ukraine enjoyed freedom of movement in Europe, a significant proportion of the population would leave and never come back, as has already happened. It would be left a total wasteland.
Well, I think this is probably an opportune moment to pivot, shall we say, to another story in our lineup for today, which is the developments in Slovenia recently. Now, you and I have talked before about the machinations that the British, in particular, involved themselves in the former Yugoslavia, to, by hook or by crook, drag these countries with unwilling populations into the NATO alliance in order that they can be essentially used and controlled by London for various different purposes. And which is the way in which the British in particular, but also the US, see the NATO alliance, particularly its eastern flank. They are there to be disposable soldiers for the great and glorious defense of Western civilization, or the profit margins of the City of London firms. It's probably more that, but in the minds of the people who say things like Western civilization, the two are very much the same thing. So now we've got Slovenia a former Yugoslav republic, which has long been a favourite of the West, are now announcing that they're going to call a consultative referendum on NATO membership. Kit, what's behind this, and is it likely that this this promise from the Slovenian politicians is real? And is it the fact that the mere existence of such a commitment, which flies in the face of NATO's own orthodoxy, which is that you can never vote on NATO membership, is this a significant move in and of itself, even if it doesn't actually go anywhere?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that it's particularly interesting this is happening in Slovenia because, yes, Slovenia has been held up as a model because it was the first Yugoslav public to secede, in part because they were being asked by the central Yugoslav government to contribute more to the country's defence, funnily enough, although there were other issues afoot as well, including the British and the Americans and the Germans encouraging them and offering them inducements to secede and therefore start the process of breaking up Yugoslavia. But ever since, Slovenia has been this regarded as this very sleepy, very stable, economically prosperous country. Now, it is led by a very dull kind of liberal social democratic government. And its politics typically go along that most of its political parties kind of fit into that mold. Now, Slovenia's left party, and we can of course ask questions about whether it's the extent to which it is truly left. They are pushing. They are a junior partner in the government coalition. They are pushing for a referendum on increased defence expenditure and, by extension, NATO membership. Because, of course, as we discussed on a previous episode, NATO in late June had its annual summit, which lasted 2 hours, and it was like, I think the Times of London worked out it cost $1 million a minute. Or something like that. This conference to convene, and the key kind of top line agreement to arise from it was that all member states by 2035 would increase their military expenditure to 5% of GDP. Now, Slovenia has pretty much consistently failed to meet even the 2% GDP spending target. It has always had fairly low levels of public support for NATO membership. It's kind of tepid at best. Now, I've included in the show notes, there's a survey from 2023 which had of Slovenes, which had some very interesting findings, which was that only 30% of the population believed that a true picture of the war in Ukraine was emerging from the mainstream media. There was a huge amount of distrust about the kind of one side, because the Slovenian media took the line that this was this unprovoked war of evil aggression by Hitler 2.0. 70%, nearly 70% of Slovenians explicitly stated they didn't trust the media's coverage of the proxy conflict. The same survey found that only 56% of respondents believed that NATO membership was important for the country's national security. It was like last among countries polled, and less than half of the population believed that Slovenia should defend another NATO member in the event of an attack. This is NATO's much rather notorious and controversial Article 5, which allegedly provides for collective defence, although Trump, of course, has expressed some skepticism about whether he'd be willing to uphold that principle if the Baltics or even Poland were attacked. Now, I think this is highly significant because, yes, sleepy Slovenia, which I might add, its government has also called for dialogue with Russia, and its leaders have very plainly stated that talking to Russia doesn't mean that we agree with them or that we are Russian assets. And unlike in, say, Robert Fico in Slovakia, where anti-NATO sentiment is also very high, the Slovenian government can't be painted as kind of extremists. You know, they're cuddly, fluffy, sleepy, non-offensive figures. So I think this creates a lot. It creates a lot of problems for NATO in narrative terms, but more generally, in yes, as you mentioned, the process of getting a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but particularly former components of Yugoslavia, into NATO has required extensive skullduggery, coups, colour revolutions, civil society penetration, the creation of pro-NATO media outlets, propaganda campaigns, all sorts, and frequently corrupt criminal tactics to get politicians to sign off on joining. Macedonia was forced to change its name to North Macedonia, which was opposed by close to 90% of the population, and there was all sorts of chicanery to get that passed, and it's absolutely hated today by the overwhelming majority of the local population. But the point is that a large number of people have been asking lately across Europe, do we really want to be part of NATO? And actually, for the first time, people are questioning what NATO actually is in a way that they weren't before, perhaps, because it's not just simply a defensive alliance. It is a way of ensuring US military domination of Europe generally, but also these countries specifically. It is a bonanza for Western arm manufacturers because countries have to spend enormous amounts of money on US and British weapons that often don't even work. But also as well, yes, it is a way of it has been a way of enshrining privatization. If you go back to the Senate hearings on NATO expansion, people like Joe Biden were openly talking about how, well, once Poland's in NATO, it will be easier to privatize its economy. Bulgaria, where there is significant levels of public sympathy for Russia, their membership was made contingent on the government selling off various state owned industries to the quote-unquote right buyers. This has been largely off the agenda in terms of discussions about NATO for 20 plus years. Finally, it's becoming more of a mainstream question of what precisely is this that we've signed up to, and do we want to be signed up to it? So it's unclear whether this referendum will go ahead. It is unclear whether it will be consultative, which is to say the government can just ignore the result if they don't like it, or whether it will be legislative, which is to say it is binding. But could this trigger a domino effect throughout the region and add further fuel to the NATO fire? I think pretty much certainly.
Well, I would say also that the joining NATO is controversial enough in itself amongst many countries, populations, but even amongst those who were sort of tacitly acquiescing to it. In like 1999 or 2004, this all looked very risk-free, basically. This all looked like something that you could just do, and it was all part of joining the Great European Garden, etc., etc. And that was all well and good. Now it's looking distinctly risky because Ukraine, everybody can see, apart from those who are blinded by the same, shall we say, special substances that Mr. Zelensky and allegedly Monsieur Macron and Sir Keir were maybe all indulging with on that trip to Kiev that time. And certainly that apparently Prime Minister Meloni of Italy likes to engage in, judging by the very twitchy statement she gives to the press. But you'd have to be on a lot of that stuff not to see what has happened in Ukraine. And you would have to be pretty far gone on NATO propaganda to not realize that the US, as we have emphasized over and over again, and the British and the French and the Germans, can't do anything in Ukraine. They can't stop the Russians. They also might just be starting to realize, some of these clowns in Eastern Europe, that, oh, right, yeah, they'll do the same to us. They'll do, like, Poland, Polish, like, so-called nationalists, I don't think they are nationalists, by the way, because if you're prepared to sell the entire economy off to, like, US hedge funds and British City of London parasites, then you don't have a nation, basically. You have a fancy building that you sit in and pretend to run things, whereas in reality, you have surrendered control completely. Now, the question of this, I think, has been sharply reinforced by the fact that the NATO side is visibly losing in Ukraine, and that everybody knows now. Even Pavel, the idiot former Czech general who's president now, admitted recently that, well, we can't fight Russia indefinitely, and they all know this now. So and also the fact is that the life of the population is getting worse, and so. And some of the blame for that lies upon the sanctions regime on Russia. So as we can see in this survey here that you've added to the show notes, like, a lot of the populations of Eastern Europe are starting to realize that the sanctions are completely and utterly ineffective. The highest of those, of course, recorded here, the highest poll ratings for the sort of anti-sanction side of things come in Slovakia and Bulgaria, Hungary to an extent as well. So that, and of course, Romania is pretty high in terms of those who think they're ineffectual. The poll's a little bit contradictory because it says that on the one level, people don't believe the sanctions are effective. And on the one level, on the other hand, people think they should continue. So I think that the way that even this poll's been taken is somewhat twisted. But I think that there is actually far more skepticism about the sanctions policy and the whole war policy against Russia in the east of Europe, and that this is being systematically suppressed in countries like Romania, where that happened out in the open, in Poland as well. And so Slovenia might be a sort of canary in the coal mine as to the way in which Eastern Europe is going to go, because being part of the European garden, to continue with Josep Borrell's rather strange terminology, was supposed to bring all these economic benefits, and it hasn't. Being part of NATO was supposed to secure and guarantee the security of these countries, and it visibly now cannot. And also that it is becoming clear that the only way Washington and London see Slovakia, Slovenia, Hungary, Poland, etc., is as cannon fodder in the event that there is a wider war with the Russians. So this, I think, is a positive sign that the long con of the EU and NATO is coming to a close, and well, thank God that it is.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I might add that the figures that you have on screen, this is, I mean, there are many fascinating findings in this report. Funnily enough, it's produced by a national endowment democracy funded organization. It has some very interesting findings. It's from May 2023, so I would imagine that attitudes towards the sanctions have worsened considerably. Now, I actually missed including this in the show notes, but there was a Politico report a few days back where it the headline was literally "Russian oil or mass layoffs: a German town's conundrum," and it was talking about how in a very specific area of the former and future East Germany, where there is a major oil refinery that is the effective lifeblood of the community. Economically, if that goes down, then it will basically just eradicate that entire community. And this is not restricted to the town in question, Schwedt. But this is across Germany, but particularly East Germany, where you do still have some. You have a lot of heavy industry as an overhang from the days of socialism. Now, that article noted that there was significant concern among the senior EU officials that other countries could follow if Germany or elements of East Germany, whether that's local governments or whatnot, elect to start importing cheap Russian oil and gas again, then this could have, yes, a domino effect, and major EU countries could start undoing those sanctions because they can't exist with them. Like, they literally cannot function economically with them in place, and they have not achieved what they backfired spectacularly and have not achieved what leaders claimed they were going to achieve. So, I mean, I think that more. Yeah, so there's that aspect of it, which is, I think that, dissent towards NATO, dissent towards the US, and the proxy war and the sanctions and all that comes along with it is actually a lot higher than, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, than one might think. But there's also, I think, I mean, you touched upon this as well, and I think this is important, is a lot of these countries signed up to be part of, whether willingly or not, signed up to be part of NATO at a time when the likelihood of their soldiers being deployed in a serious war was extremely low. It was very unlikely that they were going to be, in the firing line. Now, as George Soros wrote in 1993, injecting Eastern Europe's manpower into NATO would greatly enhance the alliance's potential because it would reduce the risk of body bags for Western NATO countries, which is the main constraint on their willingness to act. So we're kind of getting into the zone now where that they are going to be called upon to perform this role, which was always what they were meant to do. They were meant to, yes, do the fighting and dying for the US and France and Britain and perhaps even Germany. They don't like that prospect, quite understandably.
Well, I mean, the question has to be asked. It's like, well, what exactly did you think you were getting with NATO membership? Did you think you would be treated as equals? Because there's as Soros might be an evil bastard, but he does understand certain things, which is that the constraints that are on the imperialist countries are real in terms of their inability to raise armies, their unwillingness to mobilize their own populations, their fear of doing so. And so find a bunch of cheap, from the Western point of view, from the imperialists' point of view, manpower that can be tossed into the meat grinder with abandon. And that's exactly how they've treated Ukraine. I mean, it's well documented, even amongst sources in the West, by the likes of Jacques Beau, by also the likes of Andrei Martyanov, that what the NATO troops that are in Ukraine do is not just training and equipment operation. A lot of them are blocking units that stand behind the Ukrainian mobilized men, the press ganged men, and shoot them if they try and retreat. So this is what NATO is actually doing in Ukraine. This is how they actually regard Ukrainians, which is, to use an old line, theirs is not to reason why, theirs is but to do and die. Now, they can't do that with British nationals anymore, or American nationals, or French nationals, but they're going to do it with Ukrainians. And if they can get away with it, they'll do it with Poles as well. So in the end, like the great freedom that the Polish population thought it was getting in 1989 turns out to be the freedom to die horribly for the United States and Britain, which doesn't seem like a very good bargain to me, and probably doesn't to most Poles either. But that's the way it's going. And ultimately, this will lead to, or it would be a contributory factor to not only the disintegration of NATO in the East, which is coming, because the fact is that like the impulses that powered the Kalin Georgiescu presidential bid in Romania, those trends in Romanian society are only going to get stronger as the economic situation worsens and the country quite literally withers away. And so the support for NATO and the EU is going to wither away in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Slovenia, in Slovakia, and maybe even in Poland itself eventually, when the full reality of the last 35 years presents itself. I think this might be an opportune moment to pivot back to the South Caucasus, Kit, to do a follow-up on the discussion we had with Armenian journalist Alison Tamizian-Muse, which is we had earlier this week. Be sure to check it out.
It's a fantastic interview, if I do say so myself. And I think that Alison has some stunning local insights into what is actually an extremely important region geopolitically, which gets like zero coverage whatsoever in the media. But has enormous global significance. So please do check it out.
Yes, be sure to check that out. Now, what I've got on screen here, for the benefit of the audience, is a document from 2009. It's called Azerbaijan NATO 15 Years of Partnership, and you can see there the head of the Baku crime family and Employee of the Month for British Imperialism, 1994 to present. That's President Aliyev shaking hands with the NATO officialdom. And that's Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, a name I'm not convinced is real, the former NATO Secretary General, shaking hands there. And this is a celebratory document that comes from 2009 regarding the 15 years of partnership between Azerbaijan and NATO. Now, interestingly enough, the main focus of this document is on the Azerbaijani contribution to regional security as related to the NATO occupation of Afghanistan and the Azerbaijani contribution to the ISAF force that was once deployed there. But interestingly enough, this partnership agreement between Azerbaijan and NATO stems from 1994, a year after the coup that brought Aliyev's father, Haydar Aliyev, by the way, a notoriously corrupt pro-capitalist member of the Soviet late period Politburo, who ran the Soviet Azerbaijan as a private fiefdom for many years and enriched himself in the process. So this is like a prime mafia family that used to be that they got by in the Soviet Union and enriched themselves by being close to Brezhnev. Then later by with Aliyev's father, Haydar Aliyev, making himself into a reliable tool of British imperialism. But Kit, why don't you can you elaborate upon how the Aliyev family found their way into the circumstances they're in now, which is as the unchallenged, as far as we know, rulers of this British neo-colony?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Azerbaijan is absolutely fascinating. It is. I actually know personally people who have fled there because it is the kind of place where if you criticize the government in a private conversation, there is a likelihood that the secret police will come after you. Yes, there is zero critical media reporting on the government whatsoever. It ranks its Freedom House freedom ranking, Freedom House being a wing of the National Endowment for Democracy, is 0. Which is like pretty astonishing. But of course, you never hear about how repressive Azerbaijan is because it is a bought and paid for puppet of the West, Britain in particular. Now, in June 1993. Aliyev, in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, emerged as because yes, he, as you say, had effectively run it as a personal fiefdom, particularly towards the end of the Soviet Union. He emerged as as the undisputed leader of the country, and was it was deeply unpopular, and there were other political factions that were vying for power and doing so via elections. In the 1992 presidential election, Aliyev was barred from running because he was too old, because under local laws, you couldn't be president if you were over 65. Quite a fine principle that I think the US might be able to benefit from, if not other countries as well. But that's a discussion for another episode. Anyway, the point is that in 1993 there was an absolutely savage coup d'état led by Aliyev, and he has been occupied a position of total power ever since. His family basically run every wing of the state. There is total capture of the judiciary, of the media, of pretty much everything, and Aliyev sits at the head of this. Now, number one, there are very, very, very credible indications that BP, which is effectively a wing of MI6, provided the private military and security goons that helped Aliyev seize power. There was also a Daily Mail report that was published in, I believe it was 2007, and then removed from the internet entirely at direct British government direction, in which a former senior BP executive who was in charge of securing lucrative contracts in the former Soviet Union, in particular Azerbaijan, he stated that they worked with MI6 to get local officials on board with the rape and pillage of their vast oil and gas reserves. Millions were spent on debauched parties for local government officials where champagne, cocaine and prostitutes were on tap. And MI6 was well aware of and encouraged these activities. To quote unquote influence the political complexion of the region. As our discussion with Alison earlier this week kind of hinted at, the same thing is now spreading to neighboring Armenia, which historically has been at significant odds with Azerbaijan for a variety of reasons, has frequently been at war with Azerbaijan, and also historically has been a very close ally of Russia. It is now ruled by an individual called Panchian, who is shredding all of his country's long-standing close ties with Russia in favor of a pro-Western stance, and is cutting deals with Aliyev, much to the disgust of much of the local population. Azerbaijan is also, just to round this out, I might add, it has a very special relationship with Israel, and it purchases a lot of weapons from Israel. It provides a staging ground for attacks on Israel's regional enemies. Of course, it neighbors Iran, which means that it's a very valuable staging post and bit of real estate from the perspective of Tel Aviv. So none of this ever really emerges in the media, but Azerbaijan is a much more significant country than one might give it credit for. And that is reflected in the extent to which Britain is all in on maintaining this total dictatorship.
Yes, and it's worth just mentioning some facts and figures at this point. According to information from Azerbaijan's own government, and this is from May of this year, British foreign direct investment in the Azerbaijani economy totals just over £37 billion over the last 30 odd years or so. And also there are more than 500 British companies that are currently operating inside Azerbaijan. So that's a big deal. And it represents probably the most successful example of British penetration into the former Soviet space in terms of consistent economic benefit. Ukraine is, as we've already established, the British operation now runs for different reasons. In terms of Azerbaijan, I mean, this is a very successful operation that the British have run for the last 30 years. And the only confusing thing slightly confusing thing to me is that one has to ask the question of what did Moscow and Tehran think they were dealing with? Britain, I mean, the British ruling class are not, given to flights of sentimentality, certainly not towards people like Aliyev. If you put £37 billion at least into a country and you have 500 British businesses operating there, and you helped the father of the current dictator come to absolute power over 30 years ago, that's a serious commitment. And the British don't put that much money in and obtain that much profit from this relationship without exercising a hell of a lot of influence over the Azerbaijani state, basically. So, I mean, I don't expect that we can answer this question this week, but it does rather raise the question of well, what exactly did the Iranians and the Russians think was going on here? Given that not only is it that the Britain has thoroughly penetrated Azerbaijan, but also that going along with Britain in the slipstream come Turkey and Israel. And it also raises an interesting question, which is that there was a number of people, I would say, in the multipolar media space, which is something of a jungle, claiming that Turkey was drifting away from NATO, etc., etc. Now, Erdogan's always got an agenda to maximize his own advantage, but the Azerbaijan's question really shows that Britain, Turkey, Israel are absolutely unified in working together, both against Russia and against Iran, and the whole history there reveals that. So quite what the future holds for Azerbaijan is interesting, given that the British power is fading. But it shows that this is one of the most successful examples of British neo-colonialism in recent years. And it's no wonder that all references to it disappear from the internet before they can even be put up.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that just more generally as well, that I think that Azerbaijan's geographical status as a country that borders Iran, and for some reason inexplicably Iranian leaders still seek at least positive, constructive, positive relations with, despite everything. It's really quite remarkable, and inexplicable even. But it's you got to bear in mind that that Azerbaijan is a member of, as well as being a kind of NATO member, non-member. It is formally a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, as we have discussed before, this is effectively a CIA front, and it is frequently used by the US and other imperial powers to foment conflict when the OSCE's formal mission is conflict prevention. Now, we discussed in our two-part epic Yugoslavia special the role that the OSCE played in the bombing of Yugoslavia. We didn't delve into how the OSCE mission in Ukraine was handing detailed information and location data and intelligence to NATO and Ukrainian forces on the Donbass separatists to assist with their brutal war on Donetsk and Lugansk. But anyway, this, as Alex has up on screen now, this is from 2012. It's a report on how the OSCE's delegation, various member delegations, they introduced a resolution in 2012 calling for the OSCE to work for a quote unquote diplomatic solution to the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. Of course, this is a threat which never existed until Israel made the rather catastrophic decision to try and destroy Iran's alleged nuclear program, which failed miserably and makes Iran wanting to develop nuclear weapons much more likely. Again, a discussion for another story, another edition. But this OSCE report notes that Iran shares nearly 2,500 kilometers of borders with OSCE members, including Azerbaijan. And it is suggested that these states, including Turkey, Armenia, and Turkmenistan, could play a role in neutralizing Iran's then non-existent nuclear program. So, quite what Azerbaijan has done as a result of this, we don't know. Although, given that their leadership is completely dependent on, British and American brute force and diplomatic support and Israeli weapons to exist, it wouldn't be surprising if words were had with them behind closed doors and they did something as a result.
Well, that does rather bring up the question of, first of all, the nuclear program is code, by the way. In case you, dear viewers, haven't picked up on this yet. The Iranian nuclear program has been like a civilian nuclear program for many years. And so when Netanyahu, or Mr. Milikovsky, that's his real name, jumps around and starts screaming about it, when you see OSCE, which is, again, as Kit says, CIA MI6 front operation, starts issuing various proclamations about it, when you see this mentioned in the media, what this really means is they're looking for a way to carry out a regime change operation in Iran. That's the coded language that they're going to use to justify it. And notice how when the US began its regime change attempt in Iran recently, the talk of the nuclear program dropped away for a while pretty quickly. When they thought that they were on the right track and that they were going to get regime change, suddenly it was all about total surrender, the Ayatollah must die, that kind of thing. The nuclear program gets forgotten when the prize itself comes within view, which is to destroy the Islamic Republic and reverse the gains that Iran made after the Islamic Revolution of 1979 to 1980. So this is what this is really all about. And this brings up the question of the Azerbaijani role in the death of President Raisi. Because there's a series of extraordinary things about the what I think we can confidently say is the assassination of Raisi just after he'd been to Azerbaijan to see Aliyev. And the fact is that given that Azerbaijan has been riddled with MI6 operatives for over 30 years and Mossad operatives and operatives from Turkish military intelligence and Turkish fascist organizations, which is kind of the same thing. Who do you think might have been behind it? Given all of the people who have, and we know the Israelis have a base there, and that the MI6, CIA, etc., are crawling all over this place. So exactly why they thought it was a good idea to send the bunch of senior Iranian officials into the lion's den and then fly out through mist-covered mountain country in an out-of-date Canadian helicopter that was purchased by the Shah before the Islamic Revolution does rather raise a lot of very interesting questions about who was responsible and who the hell is making the decisions inside Iran, doesn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And of course, there was that rather infamous helicopter crash in the UK in the in the mid '90s, which in very similar strange, uncertain conditions crashed, and on board were a large number of senior, high-ranking British intelligence officials who took a very hard line on Northern Ireland at a time that the British government was trying to cool things down there. So there's potentially a blueprint which might originate in London there. But again, a discussion for another show. On the subject of Azerbaijan assisting Israel in its malign schemes regionally, Israel does seem to want to continue its never-ending wars, even though it's having a lot of issues, doesn't it, Alex?
Well, yes. I mean, the Wall Street Journal reports just yesterday that there is an increasingly the situation in Gaza is obviously desperate for the Palestinian population there, but also the war itself for Israel isn't going well, and not only that, hasn't been going well for a good 2 years almost, which is that they cannot eliminate Hamas militarily. The deadliness of the attacks of the resistance groups led by Hamas, but also including Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and others, their attacks upon the Israeli forces increase in their deadly nature. And reports earlier this week suggested that around 30 Israeli soldiers have been killed just in one incident earlier this week. So the Netanyahu government cannot achieve its aims in Gaza. The Palestinian population and the resistance continue to defy them. They were unable to carry out their regime change operation in Iran. They failed in the ground war against Hezbollah last year. Even though they did a lot of damage to the Hezbollah leadership, they were unable to destroy Hezbollah and lost the ground war very badly, as they would do again. But they continue, and they continue because essentially they have no choice. If Netanyahu stops any of this, he's finished. If the Israeli regime is obliged to admit that it cannot win these wars, then the remaining elements of its aura of fake invincibility will go. And I would also add that they're probably being told by certain elements within the US military and intelligence networks, or to use an old term that Marx used to use when referring to Prussia, from within the US militarist clique, to continue these wars at all costs. Recently, a US envoy to Lebanon basically presented a demand to the Lebanese government to become an open and almost acknowledged neo-colony of the United States by completely disarming Hezbollah and essentially getting it to commit to wholesale capitulation, which of course Hezbollah won't do. So Israel is stuck, just as the US is stuck. If they continue on this path, they will only add to their internal problems. But if they don't continue on this path, their internal problems will only intensify as well. So again, like the empire has essentially checkmated itself in West Asia. Now the question is, when does the fall occur? And I strongly suspect that will start to become clear to us when the inevitable renewal of the war in Iran starts, and Iran's response is even more devastating than it was last time.
Indeed, and I might add, I mean, in excuse me, in the spirit of shameless plugs, it wouldn't be an edition of Decline and Fall if I didn't do this. I think I wrote an article for Mint Press on the quote unquote 12-day war and what an absolutely colossal, crushing defeat it was for Israel. Like you mentioned, initially. The Israeli officials were talking a very big game on where this would their operation would lead. Netanyahu was openly talking about how 80% of the Iranian public want these theocratic lunatics out, and they were making much of their targeted assassinations of nuclear scientists and IRGC commanders, blah blah blah. Very quickly, they were in very serious trouble. And they were getting absolutely battered without any comeback whatsoever, really, from Israel. The mainstream media was reduced to publishing explainer guides to why the Iron Dome, which was allegedly the only thing keeping Israel safe from annihilation, is actually really crap. And wasn't able to repel Iran's missile barrages. So they've emerged from that, much weakened. They were running out of missiles and defensive missile interceptors within like 3 days. It was a bruising defeat. The only aspect of it which they can claim was a success is the completely false notion, which the Trump administration is rigidly sticking to, that US strikes on Iran destroyed completely Iranian nuclear complexes. And so I think that, both because Netanyahu's position, as you mentioned, is so is so fragile at the moment, but also because of the total embarrassment of it. I mean, this is a country which, I mean, I am old enough to remember when the Israeli officials and Israeli themselves boasted about how, well, we've never ever lost a war, and actually since October 7th, you could make the argument that they've lost several. And done so, they need to save face here. They don't really have anything really to offer anymore, apart from yet more war. Their economy is in tatters. They are regarded as, they are a total international pariah. Governments are increasingly turning on them when they are completely dependent on foreign aid to survive. The only thing that they can do to try and maintain their existence is foment yet more conflict, in the hope that the US will come to the rescue, or they might be able to get some kind of win. Now, I mean, you mentioned the prospect of that the US was pitching completely ludicrous plans to, take over, effectively, turn Lebanon into a neo-colony and neutralize Hezbollah. This is something that the British have been trying to do for a very long time. They, as I've reported for the Cradle, Britain runs a number of secret programs to infiltrate Lebanese security and intelligence forces. There are British advisors, quote unquote, and technology implanted in the headquarters of all of Lebanon's security, intelligence, and defense apparatus. And it's clear from the leaked documents that they are doing this to try and undermine Hezbollah. They've been doing this for a decade or more. It hasn't worked. Hezbollah is more popular today than it ever has been. I made this point in the aforementioned Mid-Press piece as well, that the attacks on Iran by Israel, they unified Iranians with each other and behind their government to an unprecedented extent. There was a patriotic Iranian I saw on X, who made the point that, well, this was actually, from the perspective of younger generations, her name is Sura, from the perspective of younger generations, who didn't live through the Iran-Iraq war or weren't around for the revolution, this war meant they tasted something beyond themselves, and it gave them an identity, which is fundamentally pro-revolutionary. It is fundamentally anti-Israel. It is fundamentally anti-Western. And if Israel is stupid enough to try this again, and they've indicated that they are, Netanyahu has said that he's willing to attack Iran again if he thinks it's necessary. They will be up against an adversary that is more united, better prepared, perhaps even better armed. I strongly suspect the same is true of Hezbollah.
Well, and also it must be emphasized that Israel has no choice but to attack Iran again, because that's the purpose for their existence now.
Yes,
they have to do what they're told. And if the US or factions within the US say we have to do Iran because this Russia thing hasn't worked out at all, so at least we could try and knock over Iran, well, then you better get on with it, Mr. Prime Minister. Otherwise, that retirement home in Florida might not be yours after all. So they have no choice but to go again. If they do so, then, as we have said before, the very forces which the US used to rely on in Iran, the comprador bourgeoisie faction, will be weakened to the point where they have no ability to influence things anymore. But just as shall we say, an addendum to this, the Ansar Allah have returned to enforcing their naval blockade on Israel, which has led the Wall Street Journal to start basically recycling Ansar Allah videos, which include footage of the latest ship downing, shall we say. So shall we enjoy some of the highlight reel from this just for a moment? And I'll just play this so the viewers can see it. It's without sound. You can see there that the Ansar Allah's anti-ship missile capabilities have considerably been enhanced over the last 18 months or so. And this was nominally a Greek ship, as you can see, it's sinking there, called Magic Seas, and it is the latest in a series of attacks on bulk carriers. And if you go and listen to the exchange that the Yemenis have with the crew there, you can clearly see in the video that was released by the Yemeni government that they keep warning this carrier not to advance over and over again, but it keeps going forward. Now, my theory as to why is that a lot of these ships are crewed by people whose legal work status in the country where the ship operates from is dubious, where basically if they refuse to carry out the orders of the ship owners, that they could be sacked and deported and lose their income. And so they are obliged to take this route, which is known to be highly risky, and to not turn around even when issued with clear and obviously true threats that the ship will be attacked. I should emphasize that the Yemenis rescued the crew and actually treat their prisoners very well, unlike, of course, Israel, the US, and Britain, who tend to abuse any prisoners that they take. And let's face it, they abuse their own population, so why wouldn't they abuse prisoners of war? But the Yemenis continue their blockade. Israel continues to wither. And I think it's fair to say that there is no way out for them now. But, of course, the Trump administration, always innovating, has come up with a way that they think is going to win the day for them. And that's to, in the manner of all of these things in the West these days, try to silence anybody who criticizes them. For, of course, Keir Starmer's nation. It's very true of Merz and his predecessor Scholz in Germany, where the clampdowns on free speech are going on all the time. But in this case, we've got Marco Rubio coming in and saying they're going to sanction Francesca Albanese, who's a UN human rights special rapporteur. So you've now got the US sanctioning a UN employee for accurately describing crimes that the US is engaging in. But we shouldn't be surprised, should we?
No, and I think that what Rubio, it must be stressed, in May 2024, he was among a number of Republican senators who sent this like insanely threatening letter to the International Criminal Court, in particular its chief prosecutor Karim Khan, warning him not to issue international arrest warrants against Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu and officials like Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, whose public pronouncements on his desire to eradicate all Gazans are like concrete proof of genocidal intent, open and shut case. They were threatened with severe sanctions if they carried on ahead with this, and I think the closing line was, "You have been warned." I mean, these are supposedly serious politicians writing this stuff, not mafioso thugs. But the point is that those sanctions did come to pass, and they have. I mean, I think that the ICC was, a bit of a joke anyway in many ways, and Karim Khan was, of course, was openly stated that he'd been warned off by Western officials looking into Israel, and was told the ICC is for Africans and thugs like Putin, not the West and its allies. But anyway, the point is those sanctions were imposed on the court. It cut court employees out of their bank accounts, out of using Microsoft. It basically made the ICC's work completely impossible. And ironically, Karim Khan was, at least at the start of the proxy war, making a lot of noise about how he was going to draw up war crimes indictments for Russian officials and issue warrants for their arrest, and was doing so in direct coordination with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office. So, of course, I'm sure the investigations were completely objective anyway, the point is that yes, this seems to just be the strategy now. Now, yes, Francesca, who seems to be a cut above the average, kind of UN apparatchik, or several degrees above the standard. She issued a report in a few days ago, I think, actually, and she explicitly. It was explicitly titled "From the Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide." Now, this is the second time that the UN has formally accused Israel of genocide in Gaza. It was a few months back they published a report which made this charge repeatedly, and of course it didn't get any media coverage, and it didn't really result in anything. But I think that Francesca's visibility and also her credibility meant that she was extremely dangerous. So they've now moved to undertake. The US has now moved to undertake punitive measures against her, and to disencourage others from going near that. Now, on the one hand, it's horrific, and I'm sure it will have a significant chilling effect on government officials or intergovernmental officials making too much noise about about the fact that Israel is unambiguously and irrefutably carrying out a 21st century Holocaust in Gaza, and they're live streaming themselves doing it more often than not. But at the same time, I do think that we have kind of reached this is the kind of flailing of, much like the prescription of Palestine Action as a terrorist group, which occurred the other day, courtesy of Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. It is the flailing of a cornered, dying beast. It's like, well,
Well,
we can't, our ability to manipulate people into thinking that Israel is this plucky democratic underdog fighting off, threats from fanatical Islamic extremists who want to eradicate them because they're Jews. That's dead as a propaganda narrative. It cannot be spun as anything other. I mean, even the mainstream media, to a large extent, is admitting that this, at long last, that this is a genocide being carried out by Israel. So it's like, well, our usual methods of dealing with, such issues, which includes, psyops, propaganda, civil society penetration, the use of Zionist lobby organizations. They don't have that power anymore. So this is like a blunt force, minimum, kind of lowest common denominator effort to try and shut someone up.
yes, and it's of course reveals the double game, as you indicated previously when quoting Lindsey Graham, that the ICC was always set up to play, it being the heir to the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And this was meant to put on trial mostly, Serbs, the occasional Croat, African leaders, and ultimately leaders of Russia, enemies of the US imperialist bloc, basically. But the fact is that they were trying to weaponize the ICC and to use it against Russia with regard to Ukraine, about the aforementioned Bucha massacre as well. Only then to turn around and basically try to destroy the ICC the moment that Khan realized that unless he did something, even tokenistically, that was directed against Netanyahu and Gallant, that unless he did that, there would be no credibility left for his organization whatsoever. But of course, as soon as he does that, then the US goes apeshit and basically tries to destroy it, which is now the ICC will be killed stone dead by the US, revealing that the whole concept of international justice that has been liberals endlessly fucking bleat about is an absolute farce. It was always a farce, just as international law, whilst a nice idea, can't coexist with imperialism, because imperialism abides no restrictions other than the amount of force that can be exerted upon it to make it pay a real penalty for, of course, invading and rampaging around the globe. So we are at the end of what I would call like a long period of maybe a generation of delusions about and this was my education. This was my university education: international relations, international law, rules-based order, enforcing international principles of international law and using force to do it. And all that shit was always just a mask for these interests. The Kosovo War, and again, check out the incredible 2-part special on that one, was like the real mask off moment for that, for me personally, when I started to understand what was going on. And this is the end of the road, because all of these institutions they set up in the 90s, or which stem from slightly before the end of the Cold War. So the things that turned into the ICC, institutions like the OSCE, the other UN institutions that we've talked about, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, all completely compromised, taken over by MI6 and the CIA and Mossad. So this is all of these international institutions that were supposed to define this period of unrivaled peace that the 90s were supposed to bring us, all revealed as just being tools and front organizations for the US and the British. So this is how it all ends. Before we come to our humorous ending story, Kit, do you have any final words on this story?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we could do a whole special on this. Maybe we will. Not today though. But I do think that, like, given the ICC's origins, as you rightly point out, lie in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was a sick joke created by the CIA to prosecute Serbs while insulating their assets and proxies from repercussions for horrendous war crimes. The point is that there was, for a very long time, and we are, yes, talking about 3 decades here. Like this notion of, yes, like an international legal system that transcended all borders and was led by the US and fed into this notion of like the West are the good guys and humanitarian intervention, and it's our responsibility to protect. It's our responsibility to hold governments and to account when they commit very serious crimes. Like there was a huge industry that was built up around this, and I mean in some cases in the term industry very literally. Like there is a large number of organizations, often staffed by CIA and MI6 people, who cut their teeth in the ICTY, who run very dubious justice operations, which are meant to hold the leaders of Syria to account for war crimes, which are that have been established to, yes, prosecute Russian officials, and in protecting their proxy in Tel Aviv. Proxies, the US has basically destroyed 30 years of effort in this regard. They had completely undermined their own propaganda and mythos, and it's no small thing at all. Like,
and here's to it,
absolutely.
As someone who was obliged to study this shit and take it seriously for a number of years, I am loving the fact that we are witnessing its death throes. I think now would be a good moment to pivot to, in the manner of such news shows, humorous final story of the week. Now, if you, like me, are fascinated by the way in which the English, or I should say the Anglo-American liberal mind works, you'll remember the tweets of, shall we say, rapturous ecstasy, which greeted the rise of Sir Keir Starmer to power last year, and what all of this meant to the various different characters who make up the sort of English literary shitterati, including a gentleman who refers to himself as Otto English, real name apparently Andrew Scott, the man who wrote a book saying that basically anybody who opposes British imperialism over the last 150 years has been a fake hero. You know who the real heroes are? People like Tony Blair. He tweeted out on the 10th of July last year, "It's nice, isn't it? The quiet." Kit, how's the quiet going these days?
Well, I mean, yes, a year on from this, and I might add that this tweet was much mocked and at the time, and he's since deleted it, which should tell you something about how well the silence is going. And I mean, I just think that, yes, that this is just it's so perfect that for about a week. After Starmer got in, yes, there was this kind of rapturous, almost evangelical shrieking from dull centrist dads and closet imperialists like Mr. English slash Scott about how brilliant it was that the boring adults are in charge. And we then had several months of, well, Starmer's really boring and wooden, and that's great because he's James O'Brien said it said of one of Starmer's oratories, it was a boring speech by a boring man who is doing the boring work of getting this country back together, and anyone who opposes him is fundamentally anti-British. Fast forward to today, and I'm not sure how much time Starmer has left in number 10, actually. It's been a total disaster. He has carried on every single horrendous, unpopular, hated policy of the past administration. All of their economic targets have failed. They are in very serious trouble. So, I mean, this is what I said at the very start of the show. I think we're past the decline phase and well into the start of the fall phase. Now, never forget the famous maxim of gradually then rapidly. We might be on the precipice of rapidly.
Well, I don't know, man. I mean, there's nothing in this particular series of scandals that Keir Starmer has been afflicted with that a bro summit with Emmanuel Macron cannot solve. So I don't know if you're seeing now. I mean, let's just play a quiz if you for the audience out there watching this at home. Spot what out of this image is the most fake. Is it two men trying to do like a bro handshake who've clearly never even contemplated doing one before? Is it either of the two marriages that are on screen? Is it the strength of the Prime Minister's girdle or the strength of his drinking habit or alleged affairs? Which of all these things is the most fake and bizarre? Because this is like end of the road, bottom of the barrel shit. No one is convinced by this show anymore. And we are facing the twilight of the dogs, I think is the appropriate show title to nick from Adam Curtis's better work in earlier days. But Kit, are you convinced that the Bro Summit in Downing Street will address the problems of the declining and falling French and British imperialism?
Well, I mean, who could possibly doubt the resolution and determination of these two men? A very rare public appearance for Starmer's wife. She's been kind of off radar for a very long time. So clearly, it's the importance of this photo op is spelled out by her presence. Emmanuel Macron's wife doesn't appear to be attacking him, so that's a plus. But I really think that this is just like, I mean, who believes anything either of these leaders say at this stage, or lends any credibility to them whatsoever? It's not even the people who, like Ian Dunt, who were praising Starmer as the second coming of Christ, have anything good to say about him now. And I think that Starmer is in a sense lucky that the election was only a year ago. The fact that he's in such disarray now, it does mean that there is time being called on his premiership. And while I do loathe mainstream party politics, if a genuine left alternative, or at least alternative party led by Zara Sultana does emerge, I think that we could see some defections and Starmer's record-breaking majority evaporate rather rapidly. So that's something to potentially look forward to. It might have happened by the time we speak next week, Alex. So
let's hope so.
Yeah.
Let us fast forward and accelerate towards the edge of the oblivion known as the end of British imperialism. If this next few years sees the death of the Labour Party and the Tory Party, that will be incredibly amusing and a fitting end to this particular period of history. But I think that brings us to the close of this week's tour around the highways and byways of the news disaster zone, and stopping off in a lay-by to have a well-deserved drink along the way to refocus our energy inside the realm of the Decline and Fall show. We welcome you into this news lay-by to reorient yourself around the map of history, to find yourself beyond the end of history and out of the Fukuyamarist nightmare. We are your humble guides to this particularly shell-marked, pock-marked hellscape, and we hope that you've enjoyed this ride through this display of Western decline and fall today. It only remains for me to say thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back with you next week, and to throw for a final word to our man in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Kit, you want to say farewell to the viewers for this week?
Absolutely. I think it's been quite a wild ride. We hope that you've enjoyed it and gained value from it. Like I say, please, as we often say, please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends and family, check out our previous episodes, particularly our specials. There'll be more to come, so stay tuned. God bless you, and have a nice weekend. Take care.